Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the next episode of Committee Corner. This is episode 13, and we are going to be talking about the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and also a couple of coalitions that NSPE is a part of, the Resilience Building Coalition and the Building Resilience Action Coalition. Moving forward, I'm going to call them RBC and BRAC for short, because the others are just kind of a mouthful. Joining me today is Kara Kempski. Kara is the Director of Federal Relations for AIA. She's also one of the lead organizers for RBC and BRAC. And I asked her to join me today to talk a little bit about resilience, especially as it relates to buildings and kind of the roles that both architects and engineers can play in that space. So Kara, welcome, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be here. As you know, AIA is committed to advancing resilience and climate action in the built environment. So this is a great conversation to be part of.
Yeah, I agree. I'm so glad you could join today. So as I mentioned, we're going to start by talking a little bit about the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Just a brief overview. It's a fairly small committee as congressional committees go. 9 Democrats, 7 Republicans. Kathy Castor is the committee chair, and Garrett Graves is the ranking member. The Climate Crisis Committee is charged with coordinating and advancing policies, strategies, and innovations to achieve substantial and permanent reductions in pollution and other activities that contribute to the climate crisis. Kind of a mouthful, but essentially they're charged with finding policies and strategies that deal specifically with, as it says, pollution and things like that related to issues around climate. To that end, they released a report back in June of last year called Solving the Climate Crisis. It's a very long report, and I had mentioned to Kara that I've read some of it, but not all of it. And it contains a lot of really interesting policy ideas around clean energy and if I remember right, even carbon capture and things like that. And I think you've spent a little more time with the report than I have. So were there things in it that stood out to you as things that you thought, yeah, that could really be, kind of a viable solution to, some of the issues that face us around climate?
Absolutely. I think the advantage of the select committee is that they could think really cross-jurisdictionally. They're not bound by the same sort of rules that your standing committees in Congress are.
Yeah.
The downside is that they can't advance legislation, so they can only put out recommendations. But I think they've really taken that charge and ran with it. You mentioned it's a very long report. I saw just last week, I think it was Punchbowl News that tallied up. They've released over 700 recommendations so far, since this is the second Congress that they've been around, and already had over 100 enacted into legislation. So it's a pretty successful select committee, as select committees go. But that report that you mentioned last June, there were some things kind of outside the scope of what AIA focuses on, some other industry specifics that we didn't comment on. But as far as the building sector, there were some really important policies in that report. We actually released a press release at the time that championed some of the recommendations that we had put forward that then they included. And I know your group and many others have worked closely with them as well.
Yeah.
Some of the things that we saw in that report that was great is an emphasis on incentivizing the adoption of building codes, including the 2021 IECC Zero Code Energy Appendix. It's something we've been really supportive of. And so having that called out right in the report was huge. And as we know, building to the latest codes is also incredibly important for resilience as well, in addition to energy efficiency. So seeing that highlighted was big. Also, the kind of socialization of the idea of embodied carbon. I think that's an issue that's come to the forefront for folks on Capitol Hill just in the last couple of years. When we were talking about that a few years ago, that wasn't really as big in the discussion. But this report and some others highlighted that and said, that's 11% of the emissions problem. We can't ignore that. And so that's also helped with, encouraging retrofitting and looking at the existing building stock as part of our resilience and climate goals. And then in addition to that, it called out for more weatherization assistance program. That's
Mhm.
something our coalitions talk quite a bit about. Many of our groups have really highlighted. That's a great program, but that is underfunded and has been underfunded for many years. And so seeing that elevated was great. So there's many more items in that report. If folks want to read it or read the executive summary, that does a pretty good job highlighting the big things. Definitely take a look. It's still available online. But they're taking this opportunity to think holistically and really going for it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great summary. That I feel like you hit on on most of the things that actually stood out as I was looking at it too, especially as it relates to the, to buildings. I mean, that's an area that I was glad to see some of those proposed solutions in this report, because I feel like that, I mean, buildings are part of infrastructure. We'll talk a little bit more about BRAC and some of its activities, but we just sent a joint letter to Congress about buildings being part of infrastructure. And yet when it comes to issues around sustainability and resilience and climate, buildings aren't talked about that much. Um, or at least in my opinion, not as much as they should be. So it was encouraging to see, some of those things that you mentioned, in that are in the report, because it just gives us more leverage in our conversations around building resilience and things like that, because it isn't just us as outside associations promoting this, but there are members of Congress who see building resilience as a part of the solution as well, which is really encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the members of the select committee also sit on other standing committees.
Hmm.
So having this as a group that can kind of cross-pollinate and bounce ideas off of each other and
Yeah.
report back, I think is kind of one of the goals of any select committee. And so that certainly helps as well, to your point.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. And so kind of with that in mind, the select committee held a hearing on June 11th that was specifically about building resilient communities. And so of course that, was one that stood out to me and that I had wanted to be sure and listen in on. And some of there were, oh, wait, sorry about that. Get this to work. Several witnesses that were part of the hearing. Eric Garcetti, who's the mayor of Los Angeles, Satya Rhodes Conway, who's the mayor of Madison, Wisconsin, Keisha Lance Bottoms, the mayor of Atlanta, and then Kirsten Wallace, who's the executive director for the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association. And the hearing was not quite 2 hours long. Lots of conversation around just some really interesting ideas. One of the things that really stood out to me was LA has a plan to be at 97% clean energy by the end of the decade and 100% by 2035, which I thought was fascinating. The mayor of Los Angeles specifically said that they recognize that buildings are the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases and are a crucial component of any climate specific or resilience specific plan. And then also in Madison, Wisconsin, and you had mentioned this, as part of the report from before, working to upgrade old apartment buildings to improve efficiency and resilience. And this one was near and dear to my heart, exploring urban forest solutions like increased tree canopies and things like that. Because I actually sit on the Falls Church City Urban Forestry Commission. And so this is one of the things that we talk about a lot in terms of resilience is, exploring ways to make green spaces, kind of part of the solution in, dealing with, urban heat centers and things like that. And then there was also conversation about resilience and efficiency as equity issues, which is starting to become more and more of the conversation. Um, and so those were just some of the things that stood out to me in the hearing. And yeah, I guess I kind of want to without putting you on the spot, just kind of, ask you, Kara, if there were things that had also stood out to you, or if you've seen, kind of some of the plans from, LA and Madison and some of the other places where they're really working towards this idea of a just a more holistic approach to resilience that includes, buildings as part of, kind of the community as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where we think communities across the country need to go, and we want to be helpful in that. I think as architects and as engineers, our memberships are really trusted advisors for their clients about what solutions are out there, what will fit in the budget, but is also smart, thinking long term about your energy usage, where that energy comes from, and
Mhm.
also how else to kind of protect your community from more severe and worsening conditions that are already happening and that we know are projected to continue.
Yeah.
I think this is a great list. And one of the other things that stood out to me from the mayor of Madison, Mayor Rose Conway, was when she talked about heat also, that they're very concerned about flooding and other events, but also just heat waves. And that's something certainly the West is dealing with right now. And I grew up in outside of Rochester, New York, so similar climate to Madison. And it's true. I grew up in a place we didn't really have air conditioning in most people's homes, or if you had it, your parents were probably like my parents, and we just never turned it on.
Yeah.
They'd actually get AC, and that's becoming less and less feasible for a lot of communities in that previous climate. And one of the things that stood out to me in her testimony was talking about um, it's not just the heat, it's the sustained heat over multiple days and the fact that it's not going down at night.
Yeah.
People can't cool off. And I think that's a huge issue from a resiliency standpoint. And it's all the more reason to make sure that buildings themselves can continue to operate if, the sort of passive survivability is huge if the power does fail. And it's also, it's kind of in that nexus between if everybody gets an air conditioner now and those aren't efficient, if they're older models, that's just contributing to the problem. So, but we can't ignore it either. We can't just say don't get air conditioning. There's got to be a layered approach here that's thoughtful about what people are experiencing, are likely to experience,
Mm-hmm.
and doing it in a way that doesn't further contribute to the issues that we already have.
Yeah.
I think that's where we see, our membership, your membership, our coalitions broadly, is being able to help think that through.
Mm-hmm.
That one stood out to me also.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that stood out to me too, and you mentioned it before, was the importance of updating codes around buildings, because several of the witnesses in this hearing, talked about, and I think it was the mayor of Madison in particular who talked about how constrained they are as a city, because so much of the codes around urban forestry and resilience and things like that are controlled at the state level, and so their hands are kind of tied in terms of how innovative they can really be in exploring some of these options around resilience and dealing with urban heat islands and things like that.
Yeah, it's a good point. And that's something certainly, as we talk about the federal advocacy that we do, codes are at the state and local level. And so what the federal government can do is provide more funding for incentives, for training and technical assistance to help people get there. But it really does highlight the importance of being involved at all levels of government.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, okay, I am going to move on now to my favorite part of our conversation, which is to talk a little bit about, or maybe even a lot about, the Resilience Building Coalition, and then the Building Resilience Action Coalition. So NSPE has been part of RBC, I think, since it started several years ago. The Building Resilience Action Coalition is a more recent, sort of creation that came out of that same group. And I wonder, Kara, if you can talk just a little bit about, about really kind of, about both, about you know, the idea behind the initial coalition, and then now this new action coalition that's been started here in the last few months.
Absolutely. So the RBC, as you mentioned, was formed a few years ago. It was actually before I started at AIA, by a few of our colleagues and also working with NIBS to launch that original group. And I think the idea there was to try to bring together industry leaders to talk about resilience generally and sort of best practice share among our different organizations and raise the awareness of this issue within our own memberships.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, with infrastructure seeming to pick up some steam this year, we realized this was also a really powerful group to be weighing in with members of Congress and just federal policymakers generally about how would you actually do this? How would you put resilient infrastructure package together and include the building sector and really raise that alarm that the building sector needs to be included, as you mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
And so recognizing that not all groups within the original RBC have the capacity to lobby, some based on their tax exempt status or just their preference don't do that. We wanted to create a little bit of distance so that folks in the RBC could continue to work with that group. But for those who also wanted to do more direct advocacy, we have this sister group now, the BRAC, that has a lot of the same folks and is really targeting members of Congress and the administration about why the building sector is an important part of their climate goals, of their infrastructure work, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So we've done a couple of letters so far to send up to the Hill. We did an action alert that hopefully everybody watching this saw and was able to participate in. That was coordinated among our different groups to try to get a big groundswell all weighing in at the same time. And we're planning on more throughout the summer. I think, hopefully earned media, infographics, other things like that, that the full group can then use with members of Congress and with our folks to continue to make this case, as negotiations seem to be changing every day, what they're going to do or not do. It's important for us to keep it up because a lot of moving parts to this, and it's easy to get lost in that shuffle. So we want to make sure that we're being repetitive, right on this side of annoying. I think that's
yeah, that's a good way to put it. Not quite this squeaky wheel, but pretty close. Yeah,
persistent. I guess.
The thing I appreciate about the Action Coalition, and really about the RBC too, is that first of all, I appreciate the broad scope of the organizations that are involved. I appreciate that the design professions are involved, and then you also have the concrete. Well, there's I think more than one concrete
materials groups.
Association or cement association, building contractors, electrical contractors. I mean, it sort of runs the gamut, and there's a real power in all of us speaking with a collective voice about, especially when it comes to things like resilience and making sure that at the federal level, as Congress is working on infrastructure policy and specifically resilient, things related to resilience and the climate, that buildings are included in that. It gives, it helps elevate that specific aspect of the issue. But then I also appreciate the specificity of both coalitions, because I feel like it makes it easier for us to find targeted things to work on. It's one of the things that when you start talking about infrastructure, people's eyes can kind of glaze over, because it encompasses so much that drilling down to a point that it's specific and that it relates to people's profession and to their area of expertise can really become a challenge. And so it's one of the things I appreciate about both coalitions, is that specificity. I feel like it helps us create much more targeted messaging and also much more targeted solutions around resilience, in a way that if we were just looking at resilient infrastructure more broadly, would be really hard to sort of drill down on. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. I think infrastructure and even resilience itself is kind of one of those terms that it can mean different things to different people.
Yeah.
That was one of the early things that the RBC did was sit down, okay, to our groups, what does resiliency mean, and set out that definition,
Yeah.
which I think is really clarifying and really helpful. And one of the things about both groups that I think is also important is that all of the things that we do are opt-in. And so
Mhm.
everybody's still doing their own advocacy work if they advocate, you know, still doing their own research if they do research.
Yeah.
These are the things that we agree on that we can put our collective voice behind, and it's always opting in. So even if you're in the RBC or the BRAC, if you don't like the direction of one of the letters, which is not in your scope, you're not going to have to sign that, you know. So each group still maintains their own distinctive viewpoint, but we try to
Mhm.
really focus on those areas that overlap, because I think you're absolutely right. The more we can speak as an industry, the more powerful it is to others who are listening.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I'm really grateful for just the work that both the RBC and now BRAC. I'm really excited about BRAC. I feel like we're going to have a lot of really exciting opportunities, not only for the organizations but for members to get involved. And it's one of the things that I'm excited for the possibility of um, having things for our for our PEs to really be engaged in, where resilience is concerned, because like you said, architects, engineers, design professions like that have a significant role that they can play and that they do play in, not only in resilience, kind of in the space as it exists now, but also in innovating solutions. And so I'm excited for the involvement with BRAC and with some of the things that I think our members are going to be able to engage on going forward. I think it's going to be really cool.
I'm very excited too. I think it's a great group, and yeah, we're thrilled just with the potential and what we've already started doing. I think we're starting strong and just want to keep building from there.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, Kara, thanks again so much for joining me. This was really good.
Yeah,
Um,
thank
and
you.
to anyone who's listening, watching, thanks again for tuning in to another episode of Committee Corner. If you have questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me or to Margaret Edwards, our policy associate at NSPE. We're happy to answer questions both about both of these coalitions that we talked about. If you have questions about the House Select Committee or the report, um, or if you have expertise even that you'd like to lend, we're always excited to connect with you all. So feel free to reach out. And Kara, again, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm so glad that you were able to join. I think this was a really good conversation.
Well, thank you for the invite. And on a personal, my dad's an engineer, so
Oh,
appreciate
great.
all that you guys do. So
That's awesome. Well, thanks so much. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in, and we will have another episode for you again next week. Thanks so much. Bye.